Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing well,
Good.
and want to pursue a little event that's about to happen tomorrow, and that is the big summit in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll be at the Hotel Hilton for all we know, but no, summit meeting between Trump and Un.
Yeah.
And they've had one meeting, and of course, the anti-Trump people had to ridicule that and make fun. But you know, we like to see any type of opening, and hopefully this is beneficial. But some say that Trump's only doing this for self-centered reasons. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize, you know, and well, if they really make significant changes and North Korea changes it, Trump should deserve some, you know, the credit for this.
More than Obama.
That's right. Obama, what did he do? And he got that before he became president. So my question is, I remember well, June 25th, 1950. I was 14, just out of my freshman year, and the war started. And it was under UN direction, but it wasn't. The war was not declared. The UN just gave the authority that all the nations would get together and go in and settle this border dispute. So there was never a declaration of war, never gave them to Congress, and we never declared war against North Korea. So if you don't have a declaration of war and it's just a police action, how do you have a peace treaty? How do you end a war that never existed? You know, and of course, I'm just poking fun at, you know, this whole idea that it wasn't a war, that it was a police action. A lot of people died. A lot of Americans died. I don't have the number of how many Koreans died, both North and South, but there was, at one time, the usual number that they used for Americans having been killed in this battle, 3 years, was 54,000. Later on, they kept whittling it down. They say, well, some of them weren't on active battlefield. It was over here, and it was incidental. And so now the official number is 37,000. Still a lot of people, but it's interesting that they made it look a little less onerous by lowering that number. But you know, they're going to have the summit, and it would be good if they had this declaration of ending a war that was never declared. but if you just look at the left media, they're looking for, you know, to make a lot of fun of this and poke fun. They certainly would be hysterical if Trump got the Nobel Peace Prize. Quite frankly, I think you have to be more establishment to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Probably if real peace breaks out and North Korea joins South Korea and they're a happy united nation again, they still probably wouldn't give Trump the Peace Prize. But anyway, if that's his incentive, that's good. And there's a little bit of effort in the right direction. But I keep thinking, and others have thought about this too, what would it have been like if immediately after World War II, the United States put their mind to it and decided, you know, maybe non-intervention would be a good policy. And when you can think of Korea and Vietnam, the Middle East, and all the tragedies that have happened since then, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, or even millions of people who have died as a consequence of interventionism by various countries, but especially by ours, because we were the top dog. So, of course, we can't change that, but we can keep making the point that so much of the tragedy of Korea has been a consequence of a failed policy. And if you really want to dissect this out, you ought to look at the settlements after World War II. Think about how Eastern Europe was given to the Soviets. I mean, they didn't really win it because we were the top dog at the end of the war. The Soviets were in a disaster. The same thing in Korea. They had never been in Korea. They never fought there. But after the war ended, they marched in and took a hold. And of course, the internationalists divided up and say, okay, looks like South Korea can go with the Americans, North Korea can go with the Soviets, and they make this deal. And it's those kind of internationals deal with the support support of the United Nations, getting us into the war, and then ending up with peace treaties like that are still going on 69 years.
Yeah.
It's time for it to stop. It's time for a true peace treaty and for us to get out of Korea.
Yeah, exactly, absolutely. And, I think the whole issue of a peace treaty, of course, with the U.S., because we were never at war technically, but I think for Moon, who is the real driver, and it's, if Trump wants to take the credit, that's fine. Of course, the U.S. media will never give him the credit. But the real driving factor in this is Moon, the South Korean president, who was elected to do this exact thing, to renew the Sunshine Policy, to reopen talks, to reopen relations with North Korea. And he's done a fantastic job. There's no question about it. So for him, for Moon, he would like to see this treaty, because, of course, the North and the South were at war. This would simply be a trust-building gesture. The way the media treats this summit is like a football game or a baseball game. Is Trump going to score? Is he going to kick him? He's going to. And in reality, as you know, the diplomacy is an art. It's give and take. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, and so the expectations are unrealistic. But this would probably be a realistic, marquee level kind of achievement if this is achieved.
One split on the Democratic side that I think is a healthy split is, Bernie Sanders has taken a position on this. He's praised Trump for going to North Korea. So I think that is good because, the Main Street media and most of the Democrats are always going to pick at this, and it can't be ever construed as a success for Trump. That they won't allow that to happen. So I think the fact that Sanders broke and other progressives have done the same thing. There's a few good ones around. I'd like to see more Republicans given honest support for this, but right now he's in the driver's seat. Trump is for our position. But then again, we have to deal with this. It's not part of a well thought out foreign policy. It just happens to be one item in a conglomeration of interventions here and there, and one is increased troops, and the other place it's trying to work for peace, and which I think is good when he does the right thing, but it's also a detriment that there's not a principle that brings people together. Intervention in economics, every once in a while they do a correct intervention, they might lower regulation. But the important thing is, what is the philosophy of the government in relation to our foreign policy, our domestic policy? And that is what is absent. So hopefully we can contribute to the fact that the philosophy of military intervention is important. And when there's an opening like this and moving in the right direction, we should hope some good comes from it.
And his supporters, and they are some pretty strong ones, and I think in some ways some fairly blind ones. They would argue that he does have an organizing set of principles. It's America first, but I don't see how you can argue that the position in, for example, Venezuela or elsewhere is really putting America first. But you mentioned Bernie Sanders and another representative, Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
She's got a good take on it because she's done a couple of tweets today. Her emphasis is, hey, you better believe that Kim is watching Venezuela, because this is all about trust building and establishing trust. He's watching the U.S. overthrow Venezuela, attempting to overthrow Venezuela because it's weak militarily. So if the pressure is for him to get rid of his nuclear deterrent, and he looks over at what happens when you do, when he thinks about Gaddafi, and remember, was it Bolton who even said Libya is the model? When he thinks about that, he's going to hesitate because he sees what happens when you give these up.
Yes, and there's been a temptation for the other side always to argue for our troops to stay where they are. Don't leave Iraq. Look what happens.
Yeah.
The Al-Qaeda will come back. Of course, they were never there. Same way, they're always arguing, and the excuse they give, the historic excuse they give is, well, we stayed in Japan. They're voting all the time to get rid of us, but we still stay. And of course, we stayed in Europe, and we gave tremendous financial benefits, to the Europeans because we paid for their defense and sort of, stood up against Soviets and the Russians at the time. So they always use that as the excuse, and therefore keeping troops around the world, Syria, that's the reason you have to keep the troops there. And when this would come up, when I got into a couple little debates on this issue, I would say, our intervention in the war, nothing is ever really won. What was really won in the Korean War? I mean, essentially didn't win, and we had to win in Vietnam because there would be a domino effect.
Yeah.
So no, we didn't win in Korea, and we left a mess there that we're trying to clean up. And then if you look at Vietnam and say, well, and my argument was that in peace you win more than in war. The French and the Americans were in Vietnam for 20 years probably, and thousands, if not millions, of people have died over there. The French, the Vietnamese, the Americans, they died, and we flat out lost, and lost because we weren't defending the homeland, and it was a big loss. So it's sort of ironic and interesting that. By making this statement that more can be gained in peace than in war, we didn't accomplish anything in Vietnam. And look, we lost. We walked away. We didn't keep troops there, and they became westernized. They didn't go, the Soviet system fell apart.
Yeah.
And we were supposed to be there to head off the Soviets from, taking over Korea and Vietnam and all this. And now just look at what's happening with peace. I understand we do a lot of traveling. It's been happening for a while. And I think we do a little bit of trading with the Vietnamese.
Exactly. The whole domino theory was a lie. Communism collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Last year, I was just looking up some figures. U.S.-Vietnam total trade in 2018, I believe, was $54.3 billion. That's a little chunk of change, and it's actually a trade surplus on the U.S. side. So we did achieve much more. We lost Vietnam, but communism fell anyway because it was destined to fall. And that's one of the lessons that people now itching for Venezuela are not understanding, that these systems do collapse, and they collapse a lot sooner and with a lot less bloodshed if you simply let things take their course.
Well, it'll be interesting if they do make one step forward, how tediously they will have to require more nations to be involved, the United Nations involved, and get all and mess the whole thing up. And I still think that just leaving isn't a bad idea. We left under the worst of circumstances in Vietnam, but we just go in and we don't declare war, and that to me was the most upsetting thing. Even back then, when I was a lot younger, why is the UN doing this? The United States didn't declare war. It's the UN that did this, and so I think that the way we go to war, and that was a significant turn after World War II. You can argue the pros and cons of what our policies were in 1 and 2, because some of it was pretty bad, especially World War I.
Yeah.
But it is so much better if you just follow the war rules. And I think people eventually, to a large degree already, will look at us going to war in Korea without a declaration was a big event.
Yeah.
And it was realistic to me because shortly after the war was started, one of my teachers was a veteran from World War II. Mm-hmm. He was called up immediately and didn't come home. Mm-hmm. And that had an effect on me. What's going on here? And started asking questions.
Yeah, a real turning point. The problem for Trump in this, and I would hate to be him, and I'm not a fan, but he's going to be pilloried by the media and everyone if he comes back with anything less than Kim's scalp, in his hand. He's going to be pilloried because the expectations that they raise for this are so unrealistic, and it just becomes so obvious. I was just looking at some of the reactions in the comments, and the Democrats really are the war party. I mean, there is just no question. Unfortunately, much of the Republican Party remains the war party. But listen to Schumer. Trump's goal must be complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of Korea. Anything short of that would make North Korea stronger and the world more dangerous. It's zero sum. Mark Warner, he can't just show up and take a few photos. He's got to come back with denuclearization.
Oh,
it's just unrealistic. Our favorite TV show host, Rachel Maddow, right? The news came out that the White House reached out to the Russians, who deal a lot with North Korea, and said, hey, can you give us some tips, for Trump and Kim, maybe some do's and don't do's. This is the essence of diplomacy, right? And how did Maddow spin it? Trump is bad at listening to the advice of others, but there's one advisor he seems particularly attentive to, So it's, I'd hate to be him. This is going to be a tough one.
You know, when we go in, and there's pretty good documentation of us going to countries that have something that we can obtain, like oil or something like that, natural resources. And that's why what we're talking about now doesn't seem to apply to Venezuela. You know, that's a mess, and dictatorships, and what a mess. But we insist on going in there. But we also are, like we mentioned yesterday, also in a position and a desire to take over the oil.
Yeah.
Now, they don't talk about what we're going to own after we take or get involved and say we, have a deal with North Korea and they have to obey what we tell them. They probably have natural resources, but that isn't on the top of the agenda. So maybe that's one reason that there's not as much natural resources at stake, and maybe it's much better for us to fight for oil in this hemisphere rather than going over there in China's backyard and say, well, maybe they have oil there and we better, do this. And besides, they're going to be dredging more islands and all this sort of thing. So there might be a very practical reason why this fits the philosophy they're talking about, that we have less to lose. But you're right. You're talking about make North Korea grovel.
Yeah, grovel. Yeah.
And then it'll be okay.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, I would just close. I haven't done this in a while, but we, at the Ron Paul Institute, ronpaulinstitute.org. We do a kind of a weekly mail out to people, and it's as I say, it's not a burdensome. I write a column exclusively for people who sign up, and I give updates, including about our upcoming conference. So just go to ronpaulinstitute.org and click subscribe to our updates, and we'll keep you posted on things that are happening. Of course, we will not sell or share your name or information. It's just ours. So I encourage you to do that. Dr. Paul?
Very good. And I'm going to close with a personal note, because I remember when the Korean War started, and I was 14, just finished my freshman year in high school. But I can remember when the news was announced, I heard my mother say, to nobody in particular, just exclaim, how can we put up with another war? We just barely got over the last one. It was just 5 years, and we were ready to go back into war again. It was just, I could just see it was totally exhausting to her to think that we'll be back in war again, because, it was well remembered, because we had a lot of family members and church members served in World War II, and many of them died. But here, and that was supposed to be a victory. It was a victory in the defeat of two countries that were very authoritarian. But the thought of another war just seemed to put a weight on her shoulders. The only thing I can say is, at least it wasn't prolonged like we have done lately, with the Vietnam Wars and the Middle Eastern wars and all of these things. They last forever. So I think it's the way we go to war that is so crucial, and the way we went to war in Korea, police action in Korea and called it a war, is very, very, very significant. And I think that when the true history is written to this, we made a big turn after World War II in a direction of pretending that we knew what was best for everybody. Nobody else could compete with us, and therefore we would be the policemen of the world. A bad mistake, and we have followed that foreign policy ever since. And what we need to do is change that foreign policy to one of non-intervention. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.